great one for you today. Are you interested in psychology, in its relationship with crime and punishment, in free will's relationship with culpability? Are you interested in tough love, difficult truth, fragility and resilience, harm and freedom, the thirst to be understood, men's mental health, domestic violence, workplace bullying, the necessity for nations to have shared values, healthy shaming versus cancel culture, coaching, the psychological entrapment involved in values, and more more issues in regards to psychiatry? Well, if you are, you have definitely come to the right interview. This is a great one tonight. If you're, I'm genuinely proud of this interview. I think for once I got the ratio of me talking to the guest and me speaking just right. And my guest is quite frankly brilliant. Now, perhaps it was the fact that I had a beer and he had a wine. You'll see that at the start. But this one was really intimate and really honest. I'm really interested in your opinions. I want to know what you think about this. So please get this interview out, like, share, and make sure you comment. I'm very going to be very interested in seeing what you think about this one. If you have not already done so, please consider following Northern Vibe. Without further ado, I know you don't want to hear from me. You want to talk. You want to hear from my guest, Tanveer Ahmed, Doctor of Psychiatry. So, yeah. All right. Well, look, you're a really interesting chap. You're a psychiatrist that has a private practice. You've worked in a public facility. You do forensic assessments to jails. You're a very accomplished writer. You're a journalist for a little while. And there's numerous other things you've done too. I really like the game show that you're part of. I actually want to talk about that.
Yeah.
But I first want to dive into your perspective, and because you're such an erudite writer, and I find your work very engaging. Like when I read it, like you're one of those people that kind of draws, one of those writers that draws people in. Now, the first article that I kind of want to structure the conversation around is and this is your website for all the readers out there.
Oh, right. Yeah, to be honest, that's quite an old website, Matt. So it's probably about 3-4 years old, so it doesn't get used too much. But I don't mind you putting it up. But I tell your listeners to go to not
really,
spend too much time on it.
I find your work very engaging. I would encourage them to do directly the opposite, actually, because I and this article that you wrote, "Taming the Lizard Brain," I thought was really, really good. The reason I liked it is because it's about the relationship between human psychology and technology's use of psychology to ensure that people become kind of addicted, And look, I've spoken to a number of really, really cool guests, and one of them is Dr. Paula Boddington. In a previous interview, she's a world expert actually on the morality around AI. And she believes that there was going to be a case in the future made that companies, because they're actively addicting people, to get people's attention constantly. And she believes that there's a real going to be a case in the future of a case for crimes against humanity or something else along the lines of that, because they're actively addicting this technology.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. I mean, that's already come up with Facebook a little, isn't it? Instagram and Facebook, and how clear it is that in their algorithm that they're actively trying to entrap us. And that was in the documentation. There was I've forgotten the name of the woman, I think, who sort of was the whistleblower in recent years about Instagram and Facebook. But I mean, that overlaps directly with what this woman you're alluding to.
And your article as well, because it's kind of really, if they're doing this not knowingly, it's even worse than the cigarette companies who are like, oh, we're selling this stuff. Oh, we came to find out that it was addictive. We did nothing about it. It's like you got a group of some of the best and brightest minds in the world, frankly, sitting down and going, hey, how can we addict people? That's, Dr. Boddington's right. I think that's a crime against humanity, mate. But would you be happy to kind of discuss generally around, your expertise on how that works in the human mind and perhaps the morality around it and your take on that?
I mean, it's a tough one. Arguably, it's a progression of many of the trends of, especially recent history, say the last 100, 200 years. If you think consumerism, advertising, they're all about trying to exploit our vulnerabilities. And power is about that too. So arguably, we've just got more and more sophisticated, and our tools have become more and more sophisticated so sophisticated at kind of exploiting our primitive natures. So I think we run around thinking, hey, we're rational beings, etc. Yet we have these primitive qualities, these unconscious qualities, and sometimes we almost pretend that's not as profound as it is. Yet these trends we've had, notably, advertising, public relations, politics, you name it, a lot of that race, a lot of the social and political, the race around power is how we can exploit our natures as best as possible. So what you're alluding to is a natural progression in a way that we're getting more and more sophisticated at, I talk about that the lizard brain is really about that we've almost progressed, that we essentially have these aspects of our brain that will be, whether it's fatty food, whether it's tabloid media, we're primed evolutionary to respond or be attracted to certain things. Yet now we live in an era of abundance. And again, whether it's food, stimulation, etc. But the power of modern technology is that it's able to exploit something deeper, which is really our social needs and our needs for certain types of stimulation, our needs for social status, our hierarchy, where all of those kind of things, belonging. And that's the bit that it's able to kind of tripwire a little. And that's where it adds a different level of power. So fatty food, that captures our need for high calorie food, given we're evolved for scarcity. We're evolved for scarcity out in the wild, African savanna, etc. Yet, in modern Australia, we've got abundance, and fatty food tricks us into just getting really fat. Exactly. Yeah. And likewise with social media, it entraps us to get cheap hits. We're basically getting cheap dopamine hits of social connection, of feelings of status, of just kind of transient approval, yet it doesn't give us anything terribly lasting. So it's the fatty food of social status and belonging.
Yeah, it's the fatty food for the brain. But look, I'm kind of like, because it's something that could actually be used for the good. I mean, none of these things are inherently good or evil. Well, if you used all of those things to promote the good, in so much as we know the good and we can see the good and we've identified the good, and more importantly, we agree on the good. I mean, hey, fantastic. Because really, I mean, if you look at some religious impulses, people say, oh, it's bullying and fear. I mean, there is that aspect to some religious, some manifestations of some religions at some time. But when you're also appealing to the human need for cohesion, the human need for, the tribe, the human need for consensus, and the human need for worship, like we all need to be looking at something, you know what I mean?
That's right.
It's not all bad. Like it's not an inherently bad thing. I really wonder where it's going to take us morally. And
well, I agree. I think we do get a little bit kind of, I've forgotten the term, the sky's going to fall in, this kind of stuff. Yeah. I'm definitely a reader of Mark Andreessen, the technology guru. I think he's the LinkedIn founder. And he sort of talks about, even when the bicycle came out, people were up in arms thinking, oh, this was going to destroy society, and teenagers were going to go and have sex outside because of the bicycle, like all this kind of stuff. It was going to bring down society. So every new technology brings up all these challenges. So I'm inherently an optimist, and likewise with things like social media, etc. And we are getting stricter. We are coming down harder on these groups, and they're having to be a bit more responsible. And we always learn new things about ourselves when these new technologies come out. And look at AI. We were talking about Instagram a couple of years ago, but I mean now AI, is threatening to blow up all of that. I guess, Matt, one of my big interests is, you look at public debate, public conversation, so much of it is, it'll be politicians or economists, and you have often a kind of a dry component of public commentary. And I guess one of my big aims is bring my combination of interests. For example, one, obviously I'm a psychiatrist. I'm very interested in how does psychology play out in public affairs, especially the primitive. I'm very interested in psychoanalysis, which is often about our primitive beings, that we're kind of animals, but we're social animals, and we're trying to manage our instincts in this kind of social world where we interact with others, and so much of what we call mental health or distress is a tension between our primitive beings and our kind of social or outward natures that we project. So I'm very interested. I see my role as trying to contribute an element of culture, human behavior, and the primitive, especially around the brain, and see if that then, what can I add to debate around social issues, politics, etc., through that lens? That's often how I see, and often you can add a slightly different angle. And you and I both know that, especially Australian media, it is often, my background aren't always going into jobs like that. So just coming to someone of my sort of background, I was born in Bangladesh. I came to Australia when I was young, 6 years old. I grew up in Sydney, and just having that kind of alternative background with different sort of outlooks, that also gives a different, Australia is so multicultural, including, places like Cairns, even Northern Queensland these days, is pretty multicultural. So I think it just adds a different level to the debate. That's sort of how I see even as a psychiatrist also, I see part of my job, you see people, and look, most of us, including myself, we don't always know why we do things, and, we're constantly evolving and understanding more of ourselves. I see some of my job as trying to impart, in an empathetic way, tough love and difficult truths about people's lives, right? And in some ways, I take that in my public commentary. What can I offer? Elements of kind of tough love or difficult truths that people haven't, either is kind of, if not denied, but is below the surface, and we haven't necessarily identified it. That's sort of how I see my role.
I think that's so important too. And like with that and that comes through when you're writing, you kind of, you really do remind me of that Theodore Dalrymple.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I love his writing, so
yeah,
it's a wonderful. I'd love to emulate him because he's a wonderful writer. Yeah.
Well, you do, and with the forensic psychology thing too, it's like you said, the tough love, and they're kind of like calling people out when they're telling you their self-image rather than the reality of who they are. I mean, because fundamentally, I think hard about this, and I think, what does psychology? What does the psychologist really do? Are they just like a paid friend? Are they just a counselor? Are they just kind of like, really, what does a friend do? Like a true friend do? A true friend tells you things that you don't want to hear. And rather than won't allow you too much to indulge in in your pure self-image. Because if the only people you allow around you are the ones that reflect back, what you want to hear.
Yeah, if they just tell you what you want to hear, they're not going to, it's like bad advisors. But I guess what a psychologist might add is, or a psychiatrist, I guess a psychiatrist, we tend to have a more medical component. We're more likely to use medications, and we look at the more biological basis of mental illness. A key role of a psychologist is to identify where you might have patterns of negative thinking and where that might originate in your self-image, in your value systems, all of this kind of stuff. So that's where a good psychologist should offer you something a lot deeper and help you kind of reflect and get a deeper level of self-understanding. That's what a good psychologist should do. So they need to be something more than a friend. And that's where sometimes a friend, they do have to be the ally and just be listened sometimes and be someone to cry with. And that's a sort of key difference, I think. So sometimes, and while they can, say things to your face, they won't necessarily, we're all amateur psychologists to some degree, but they won't necessarily be able to offer that depth. So there is that key difference.
Yeah. And obviously as a psychiatrist, again, that's kind of, an even more important distinction. My understanding of what you do forensically, it has something to do. Well, if you can decide, giving your expert opinion and saying, this person is culpable, this person is not culpable, that has certain implications for human free will. I'd really like you to kind of like discuss that, because this idea of free will and culpability, being an ex-cop, is something that really, really I'm deeply interested in.
Yeah, look, that's a great question, Matt. And you're right. I mean, look, you think of, all the bloody, 3 out of 4 top podcasts are always crime ones, aren't they? So people are absolutely fascinated by crime, why people do things, particularly macabre things. And sometimes I'm a bit, if not uncomfortable, part of my role is often to help explain to magistrates, and often using, police reports, this kind of thing, why people do certain things. And I'm often asked, do you believe in evil? Yeah, look, I'm not sure. I'd be interested what your thoughts are there. I've certainly seen people that are especially dark, and I can sort of partly explain it because of their upbringing, etc. Does that make it evil? I mean, they certainly feel macabre. They definitely bring out a feeling in you that might, some people would sort of class as evil. It's hard for me to say. Probably as a psychiatrist, it is hard for me to go black and white, say someone's evil or someone's inherently good. It's hard for me. I do feel my job is to try and see the good in almost all people. Even though I'm not religious, I do sort of take on a bit of a religious attitude that my job is to see the dignity in all kinds of people, including pedophiles and murderers, etc. Exactly. What's interesting about psychiatry is we're learning more and more about the brain, as you alluded to. And the more we learn about the brain, the more explanatory power we can get around behavior. So does that mean then, people don't have control, they don't have free will? At some point, people have to have responsibility. In our society, really, we still have to have a moral basis in our actions. So the way I often see my role is to help explain to magistrates and then give them a plan. Often our job is to go, they may have this problem or this problem, and this is why they did things. But what magistrate really wants to know, to what point is their behavior modifiable through any sort of treatment, right? And there are certain conditions, and pedophilia is probably one of them, where things aren't so easily modifiable. And then the magistrate or the courts will take a different position. So often my job is to go, yes, look, they probably fit under a category of some sort of mental health category. And the reality is that's not very hard to do these days. But it's not hard to kind of squeeze someone into a mental health category. But what they're really interested in is, can I actually set up a plan? Yeah, they see a psychologist, they had to go to an addiction group, they go on these tablets, whatever it might be. They do this, violence program, whatever it is, anger management program. And if they do that and they actually stick to it, can they then... So it's a carrot and stick. I think the power of mental health in crime is you can really use a carrot and stick approach. You can go, okay, you do A, B, and C. We'll let you stay out of jail for now. But you don't pursue this, we're going to come down with the stick. And look, I actually think that can be quite effective. As long as the stick is there. Sometimes what I see in my work is that the stick is quite weak. And then the incentives to engage in these plans are not as marked. So if you're firm with the carrot and stick approach in what I see in trying to modify criminal behavior, I think it can be very effective.
Well, I got to say that's really interesting, because in my experience, people have got to want to change.
Yeah.
Deeply, they've got to take a really good heart. There's got to be at least one voice, because I think the conceptual framework of having several personalities or several aspects of your personality in your head interacting with each other, I think that's a really good conceptual framework. I think it kind of like works quite well. If you've got a voice that's loud enough in the head of the offender going, you've really got to stop doing this. It's our job to kind of like bring that voice out, but that voice has to be there. We can't.
No, that's true.
I don't think any professional can put that in. I don't, any police officer can go, you can't put that in there. There has to be this fundamental desire.
No, I agree with you 100%. Like, there's no question. But part of my job and your job is to build some sort of insight, because they usually want... Another attraction I have to this type of work, Matt, is a lot of people, especially blokes, especially men, but not just men, a lot of different groups, they come to mental health not through the front door. They don't sort of just turn up and go, hey, I need help, right? They usually come through other doors. It could be their partner's bringing them, or their employer has sent them, or they come through the criminal door.
Yeah.
Right. And when in fact, there's all these areas that they can be helped with through mental health treatment. So that's one of my attractions for doing this kind of work, where you get a lot of people. And often my job is to kind of help them say, well, what do you actually want in life?
Yeah.
And you can start building a bit of attention, go, well, hang on. You say you want a better relationship with your son. You say you do actually like or you want to be a plumber, whatever it is. Can you see how some of these behaviors are going to stop that? And we can try but if you do, this and this, we can, push it in the other direction. So often that's our job. In the same way it is when we see patients wanting treatment, try and build that voice. I think everyone does have that voice, whether they know it or not. And part of our job, Matt, in some of the things we're doing, is to make that voice you're talking about louder.
Yeah. You're right. Like, I get Augustinian about this. Everybody has a fundamental sense of what's right and wrong that has been put in by the Almighty. I do have a slightly religious view on that. I don't even try to hide it or apologize for it anymore.
Look, I'm very respectful of that, and I'm very sympathetic to it.
Yeah, and kind of like, watching the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, like I've got a really good idea how this is going to play out. There's going to be a massive renewal of religion in our society, I would suggest, in the next generation or so. I think things will get worse before they get better, but they're definitely going to get better. But the other thing I really like, and something that I must say I empathize deeply with, is don't get judgy. Like, I know a lot of pets. Because I was in what was then the Juvenile Aid Bureau. We dealt with kids as both offenders and victims, and of course, I hardly need to tell you there's a big overlap with both of them. And I've interviewed quite a few pedophiles now, both in the context of gathering evidence, but also like if you're escorting someone to jail or something like that, they want to talk to you. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I haven't met anyone who doesn't want to kind of tell their story.
It's so strange because people don't believe that. They don't get it. It's like, no, give someone the opportunity to tell their story, to tell you, at least their self-image of themselves, and there may be a dissonance between the self-image and the reality, because, no one really knows what's driving them. No human being really has deep insight as to what's actually driving you. But like, they'll talk. Getting them to shut the hell up is often the issue, especially when it comes to the self-justification side of things. Like, they might go easy on the evidentiary side of things. But hey, this is why this happened, and people love that. You would have done the same thing in the same circumstance. Like, it's
people want to be understood, don't they?
Yes.
In the form, and including, as you say, murderers and pedophiles, you name it, they'll still want to tell their story. And if you open that door, and that, again, that's part of the reason why, all this crime podcasts, etc., they bring out these primitive aspects of our behavior that we're all sort of vaguely aware of, but we don't see it. It's suppressed in day-to-day life, but occasionally it comes out, even in, quite ordinary people. And that's why we're so fascinated about it.
Yeah. These things, these patterns of behavior, they just manifest in slightly different ways. Like, it's the same thing, just manifesting in a different way. Like, I do find that interesting. And the non-judgmental thing, it took me years to get that. But I've got to say, once I got that, I think it made me a much better police officer, where I could genuinely sit down and listen and just go, mate, where are you coming from? And because people can tell, they can kind of like, I think this guy actually is genuinely wanting to know where I'm coming from and genuinely wants to listen. And then people will, that will break down. I'm not a negotiator, but like, I've done negotiations where I've done that. You've got someone barricaded in, they're full of drugs and all that kind of stuff. And before the negotiators get there, like, it's Maloney, and you go and talk it out. One of the techniques that I would use was listen, like what you said, listening. But the other thing is ascertaining, what do you want? Like, I would get to once I got comfortable, I would directly ask the person, what do you want? What outcome do you want from this? And some people were surprisingly candid. Like, they'd say, look, I want you guys to shoot me.
Wow. Yeah.
I was talking about it was like, yeah, I want you guys to shoot me. I want, I want this. I want, or I just want the pain, and then you get the, I want the pain to stop, or, I want my wife to realize that I love her. I want, they'll tell you. They'll tell you, if you really listen. And that's that genuinely amazed me, in my career, I have to say.
Yeah, that's where I think, and that's where often the best policemen, etc., just having our jobs overlap significantly. The better you are at extracting information, building rapport, and feeling like you're interested in someone, the more information you're going to get. And while that sometimes will mean you solve a crime and you put someone away, etc., but you're going to be far more effective. That's why I must say I'm always a fan of people like you or I that work on the front line, and we see things at the coalface.
Yeah.
And I'm also a believer, a bit like what I was saying earlier about public commentary so often being dominated by people who aren't at the coalface.
No.
It'll be sort of economists or politicians, etc., that kind of thing, celebrities, etc., and often they're nowhere near the coalface. So that's where I feel like opinions like ours are often critical. I mean, there's limitations with our opinion. We're seeing a certain angle, and but they're just a critical part of informing debate.
Yeah, it's strategy versus tactics. Something, and you're right. That's so important. But I think this dissonance between decision making and terrible outcomes. And there's a lot of things about it. I'm now a bureaucrat, and I'm kind of limited to what I can say. But I can say this: there is a dissonance, a massive dissonance between the bureaucracy and normal everyday Australians, as much as they claim not to. That's simply a fact, and anyone who doesn't accept that is kind of like, I wouldn't want to. I'm not qualified to use the word delusional, but I would suggest to getting that close to it that it's just not funny. But I understand how it happens, because people fall in love with ideas. So you get someone that falls in love with an idea, some sort of ideologue somewhere, and they get in a position of authority, and they have the best of intentions, and they stick this idea that they've fallen in love with, and they go, well, even when you confront them with evidence, going, oh, it's playing out, the idea is bad. Okay, can we change the idea? It's like, no, because again, people link their self-image with an ideal that they've fallen in love with. Fundamentally, they see it as an attack on them.
No, of course it is. Yeah, it's deeply tied to their identity and their desires. Yeah, no, without question, Matt.
All right. So look, I kind of like, we've had a fantastic little diversion now, but one of your other articles was on bullying. Are there more bullies now, or just more bullied? Now, we don't need, we can go into the specifics of the article if you like, but what I really like about that is the issue a resilience one?
Yeah, look, this overlaps strongly with, I recommend some of your listeners look at an old book of mine called Fragile Nation.
Yes.
And that overlaps very strongly with these themes. So I'm really talking about what I call the cultural rise of mental health. So, and what's going on there. And, this bullying is a great topic where many measures, many things we call, whether it's trauma, bullying, you name it, and addiction, all of these things, they've changed from a strong objective meaning to a much more subjective meaning.
Yep.
So now it's a lot more that if I feel bullied, therefore bullying exists, the bullying's happened, right? That's enough. So perceptions have become, much more important. They've almost become a truth. And we hear that in debate, this is my
lived
truth.
Experience.
This is my truth. Yeah, exactly. Lived experience. And that's especially true if you're from some sort of marginalized group, or you're deemed, hence we all fight for victimhood status, because if we can paint ourselves as any sort of victim, we acquire a status and we can claim privileges, including stuff like that, feeling bullied, etc. And I guess that my book, Fragile Nation, looks at, the different factors that have driven this. And one is the weakening of terms, how we measure these terms a bit differently.
Mhm.
Another is almost the rise of feelings in. Thanks, man. Almost the rise of feelings in the public arena, and some people call this the feminization of the public space, and that doesn't necessarily need to be about women, right? So it's more even in the space now, so where the ideas of empathy, compassion, objectivity is almost seen as a masculine entity.
Yeah.
And it's seen as kind of harsh. And all of these, some of these trends have just elevated the notion of feelings, the notion of psychological harm. This is a really important point, Matt.
Absolutely.
Where historically, you think one of the biggest principles of freedom is the limits of freedom are where it causes harm to someone else. The John Stuart Mill principle.
Mm-hmm.
And this, at no point when he began talking about that principle would he have ever thought of the notion of psychological harm, right? Mm-hmm. And that's only come about in recent decades, where suddenly now the notion of psychological harm is a limitation on freedom. So hence, we get all sorts of debates. A good one is the Racial Discrimination Act, for example. Yeah. But almost every other week, for example, more recently, the Brittany Higgins stuff, where you say, oh, we can't have an open debate about this because she might get upset, and she's fragile, etc. So we're seeing that all the time. So that's when the notion of mental health increasingly gets weaponized and used by elites and all kinds of people for their own ends. Sometimes as a way to avoid scrutiny, sometimes as a way to try and extract privileges.
Yeah, and I think another aspect of this is these are ways of attacking the fundamental principles that Western society have been based on. Like you said, this concept of the concept of free will, which is kind of like a given, and the concept that a person is innocent until they're proven guilty. Like I used to discuss this all the time because one of the other roles that I did towards the end of my career was when I was in the domestic violence high risk team. And, oh my God, like initially, because I turned up there, I mean, who's pro DV? No one. But I kind of turned up there and I was like, this isn't about DV. This is like I mean, let me really choose my words carefully here. There are a lot of really well-intentioned people who are genuinely concerned about DV there. But there are also a lot of voices of people that I think just had psychological issues where they disliked men because for whatever reason, and sometimes it was totally legitimate, like they've been let down by a man in their life, somebody had been sexually abused, they've been neglected by their dad, or something like that had happened. And so this resentment, this bitterness was playing out in a public sphere and tragically being given authority by the government. And it's just like it really was an attack on the whole idea of due process. I had to explain it to numerous times. I got sick of doing it. It's like, they're like, why don't they just believe women? I was like, and I said, look, the entire concept of due process works on the axiom that people lie. That's
I hate those arguments too. Oh, you just have to believe someone as. Yeah. But that shows as soon as you're some sort of, going back to the bullying thing. Yeah. One of my jobs, Matt, is often assessing workplace claims, and that includes bullying, or it could be sexual harassment, could be all sorts of things. And it's a classic arena where it's all about perceptions. And part of my job is to work out how much of these guys, often people's perceptions are linked to so much of them, their values, their past. A classic example might be, someone who's been in DV relationships in the past.
Yeah. And
they're super sensitive to threat. And suddenly their male boss puts them on a performance plan. Yeah. And to them, that's quite threatening. That's like an all-out attack. And they feel like they're being bullied or something, So it's a good example. And the Australian workplace is a fascinating one because we're so diverse, whether it's multicultural, whether it's age, gender, you name it, every type of diversity is represented. So then you get so many different perceptions and reactions playing out. Yet in a more kind of just a more, what's the word? Just just a more edgier sphere, if you like, where people are much more, they're almost looking for offense. You know, we almost live in this really, really kind of sensitive arena. And it's not hard to find if you're looking for it.
But it comes down to this idea, Tanveer, that we're no longer we don't have a shared reality. Like because you know, Australia exists as a political entity. I don't think it should be related to blood or soil. I think we can all agree on that. But although there needs to be a geographical, obviously, you know, this country exists in this geographical area. But like if we can't agree on certain axioms, at least on a reality and how to measure reality, you can't be a nation.
Well, that's true. That makes it hard. I mean, this is one of the big modern crises. Do we have any sort of shared value system on which to base our society on? And you've got, you know, this goes to everything from, you know, what we teach in schools to parenting to, you know, all sorts of things. You know, this is one of the key challenges of modern societies, that if we're not imparting at least some basis, you know, it's not like we all have to believe the same things, but if we almost don't have any shared basis, like shared foundations, you know, for example, if we don't even believe in objective truths, for example,
yep. I
mean, then, you know, how do you conduct a democracy? How do you conduct a society? And look, I don't think we're so far down that rabbit hole. Sometimes I think people catastrophize some of that, but there are definitely elements of that we see in a lot of modern policy debates.
Absolutely.
I mean, The Voice is a very good example one, you know, where, you know, it's a heated debate, and there may well be some merit to the arguments, but increasingly it falls into, you know, whether it's personal attacks or, you know, you're a racist or you're because it's a marginalized groups, it's entirely about their perceptions or you can't even comment on their experience, and you know, those sort of things. So all of those sort of trends are playing out currently in the Voice debate, but that's hardly exclusive. You know, this sort of thing happens in almost every debate, you know, every other day.
See, you know, the people that do that don't really understand that they're soaring off they're soaring at the branch that they're sitting on. Like I had someone at work the other day, you know, come up, and because I indicated, oh, look, you know, I'll be voting no, and believe me, the Department of Education, that puts me in a very, 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 very small minority. And like I kind of had a person kind of presume to go, well, you know, have you ever thought about it from the Indigenous point of view, Matthew? Blah 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 blah. I said, well, the first thing is I'm mixed race. Like, it's not that means anything. Like like the color of my skin or my ethnic background means as much. You know, it's not that it hasn't affected me. Like, I am the product of these things. It's like, yes, that's the context that I was born into. I understand that, but I do have free will. I have the ability to learn. I have the ability to correct mistakes. In fact, you know, fundamentally, it's of no more point to the debate than the color of my eyes. And for that other person to suggest that I can, and I've had numerous Indigenous people say this to me, is like, you just don't understand what it's like to be Indigenous, man. You won't get it. You don't know what it's like. Well, again, that means that we don't have a shared humanity. Like, if that's true, it's not just that we can't have a political unity. Forget that. That person is claiming a certain degree of transcendence.
Well, that's right. I mean, and I can't really do my job. I mean, part of my job, for example, you know, is trying to understand someone's experience. And I can't claim to be in their shoes.
Yeah.
You know, you any sort of human connection depends on having empathy and being able to put ourselves in someone's shoes, at least in a small way. You know, so these whole arguments that you just can't even access our experience in any form. I mean, it's just, I don't know what the right word for it is, but yeah, it borders on arrogant almost. You know, it's like our experience so incredibly special, you know, whether it's in a positive or negative light, that nobody can access it. And again, it's another way, it's a bit like the mental health thing. It's almost another way of saying we're above scrutiny.
Yeah.
Right. You can't scrutinize us, you know, because our experience is so special. So then our truth is the only truth.
Yeah. And again, like, that's the most circular. There is no way of, And then if you introduce, say, well, how about we use rationality? It's like, well, rationality is a Western concept and it's been used as a blunt instrument to beat us down in the past. How dare you? It's like, you're in the most circular, there is no getting out of that.
Well, then you got no chance. Yeah, exactly.
But the people
and you can't even engage with someone. Yeah, this is one of the most difficult issues now of our time. And again, parts of the world are further down. Parts of social justice movement in the US, etc., often is a bit more extreme, but it certainly filters down into Australian debates, and it becomes a factor in my work too sometimes, where it's like I'm trying to work out, even as a male psychiatrist, especially around issues like gender in particular, you're put into quite a challenging position sometimes, where you're deemed to be your opinion is just less worthy. Even despite my ethnic background, you sort of become a person of privilege because of your maleness.
That's ridiculous. And again, you can't have, really, when it comes right down to it, forget having like a shared political unity. You're no longer, you've dehumanized that person. The thing that concerns me most about this is it's actually an act of dehumanization. Like I saw when I first, I lived in New Guinea a bit when I was a kid, and then I moved back home here to Australia, and very colonial, I suppose. And then I worked in Cape York and the Torres Straits. And what I found was, and this is a broad overbrush, but I think it's true enough to say, people would basically put Indigenous people in one of two categories: angels or demons. It's like, oh, they're so wonderful. There's just nothing they can do is wrong. Such a unique perspective. Rousseau and Notional Savage, blah, blah, blah. Or it was like, mate, they're all just scumbags, they're housebreaking and blah, blah, blah. And, they're all sex offenders and this and that. And it's like, both of those forms, both of those things are, it's different sides of the same dehumanizing coin. Like, until you can look at another human being and go, oh, you're a human being, the line between good and evil, in so much as it exists, and I do actually think it exists, runs down that line runs down the heart of each of us. We both have, the infinite capacity for good, infinite capacity to be bad. But
that's where some of your original aspect of that religious angle is really critical sometimes. Where just a notion that people have an innate dignity, and there's, whether you call it God or something above something metaphysical. I think that, again, I don't think you have to be religious to believe that, but I think the concept is a really important one. And I think then you see people in a different light. And
I kind of like the only respectful disagreement, and I'm not seeking validation here, trust me. I'm totally cool with you saying it. I know it's probably going to bring out the professional in you to sit there and nod and smile. But I'm totally happy with disagreement. In fact, I kind of like it, and it'd be good for the show, candidly. My take on that is that I think when push comes to shove, so I mean, you can accept that axiom in the sense where you're just having a discussion with someone, or in something like that. But if push comes to shove, like if you're really put in in not even a life and death situation, but like, oh, who's going to get these resources? Like, who's going to, something that feels really important, something that feels really life-changing, that feels really threatening, that feels that it's right up there on the hierarchy. I think you're always going to make, like, unless you have that deeply religious sentiment that just goes, I accept this on faith, because you can't rationalize. I don't think you can. You can always use human reason to say, and I've had some really big disagreements with John August. I know you listen. He's the rationalist guy that came and stayed. You're always going to use your reason, not for the good. Like, if you're in a circumstance like that, Mr. Harden, this is 30 years of policing talking, you're going to say, well, that guy needs a smack in the head. That guy, it's okay. It's okay to find that bit of evidence to convict him. It's okay to tell this lie. It's okay to do this. He's a dirtbag. He deserves it. I'm serving the greater good anyway. I'm actually the good guy here. But like, you need to take it on an axiom of faith. It's like, no, like regardless of the circumstances, that's wrong. And the reason it's wrong is because that person too is made in the image of God. Like, it's just, I don't think right when push comes to shove, again, in the abstract, we can sit here and talk about it with full stomachs and beer and, roofs over our heads and when life is good. But, I don't think it works. I don't think it works in tough circumstances where
Well, look, yeah, I think that is morally bankrupt. I agree with you there. Like, you can't do the whole means to an end type argument. There's a moral bankruptcy there. And you're right. Sometimes in the bureaucratic system, it's a bit like the great shows like The Wire and stuff that really captures that type of behavior where you start justifying it, you get increasingly cynical in a certain environment. But yeah, you lose some fundamentals of morals with that sort of logic of means to an end.
You did, and I used to see it. I didn't see it a lot in the police. The Queensland, the service that I was in, and things are changing incidentally, but the service that I served in was basically honest. There was high degrees of cynicism, but that's just because people just get exposed, they get brutalized. It's not their fault. Well, you got to know when you've hit the use by date and it's time for you to get out, because as much as you think it's like they got to keep on fighting this crime forever, no one else can do it. It's like, you got a number, mate. Like, if you die tomorrow, someone else is going to be sitting in the front seat of that car driving around with a blue shirt and carrying a Glock. Like, you're not that you're not that important, bro. Like, yeah, it's a higher calling and all that, but there's a reason you got a number. That's all you are. And if people tie their identities up with that, it eats them. Like, that Nietzschean idea of looking in the abyss. That's true. It's 100% true. I'd like to talk about defense of shame.
Yeah, well, that's a good one. Yeah, I guess I touched on that because, shame is a good one to talk about because it sort of brings together a few things about a primitive emotion in the public sphere. It also is about groups, because shame is all about groups, and often this tension between guilt and shame is interesting. And there's this sort of idea that Western societies, part of the sophistication of Western societies is we're more guilt-based. So it's more an internal moral compass, and it's about something we did. It's not something we are, it's something we did or didn't do, where shame is so much about conforming to some sort of group norm. At least that's how it's depicted. So it's almost depicted as something primitive. But I guess the nature of that book is really about, when is shame good? We've made it sort of kind of stigmatized. Yet shame is making a comeback, whether it's the online world, in all manner of forms. And I guess I'm arguing that shame can be used for good if, in parallel with shame, we have an automatic kind of impulse to reintegrate people into groups. So a classic example here is cancel culture, etc., where people are shamed online because they've transgressed some sort of moral boundary, yet we don't seem to have pathways for them to be reintegrated.
Yeah.
Yet historically, healthy shaming is often there's some ritual incorporated. If you think tribes, etc., somebody might be shunned into the group, but as part of that shunning, there'll almost always be automatically a pathway back.
Yeah.
And all sort of things set up for that to happen. Whereas we've got almost a brutal culture at the moment where we shame people, shun people, and don't entirely have a pathway back. But the other aspect I was talking about, even sort of a lot of modern social overlaps with social media, because social media is often about groups, but it's about imagined groups.
Yeah.
So we actually live at a time now where so much of us are alone. We're sitting at home online. We're sort of, in a historical form, we're not really part of groups. but we're part of imagined groups,
Mm.
right, online. I mean, even a country, a nation is basically an imagined group. Most of us
Totally.
aren't terribly connected, so that's where the modern shame, I think, becomes very interesting. I talk about the notion of social anxiety. I see so many people who are disconnected, and with the notion of social anxiety, we're very fearful about how we're perceived and very fearful of being judged. I talk about that as a modern version of shame, right? Yeah, we wouldn't necessarily see it in that form, but it's a modern version of shame where we're seeking approval, we think we're not good enough. And it's a modern version of shame in a very meritocratic, competitive society where it's all about, have I risen up through the ranks? Have I achieved enough? Have I made enough money? Do I look good enough? And that acquires a moral dimension. And the backdrop to that is there's all these people, they're not good enough, and they become avoidant and they become disconnected. And I guess I'm arguing that there's a component of that can be seen as modern versions of shame. Exactly. Yet we don't necessarily call it that.
No, exactly. And look, this woke movement, I think about it a lot, and it came to me in focus. Like this idea came to me because the Floyd murder happened while I was still in the police, and so I was up here for some of the marches and whatnot just before I got out, and I'm watching these people like marching down the street, and they're stopping, they're chanting, they're kneeling, they're getting up, they're walking, they're singing together. And I'm a Catholic, like I know ritual when I see it. I know, a communion, and again, like it's all the things. It's like there's this communion. These people are coming together. They think it's for a greater good. They're engaging in a ritual. They're all, feeling, getting the sense of, they're getting the sense of being on the side of good. And I was watching this, going, whoa. And it kind of really helped me to understand the woke movement, because it's a kind of upside down, distorted, inverted Christianity. Like you said, it's got all the shame and all that kind of parts of Christianity, but it doesn't have the forgiveness.
Exactly. Yeah, there's components of it that don't. Yeah, they have one part of it, but not necessarily the other.
Yeah, it's a distorted form of like this. Yeah, it's really weird. But look, I'm really keen to, like, God, mate, I could talk to you forever. But like, I'll get to the next book. Can you discuss The Exotic Russell?
This is my first book. Yeah, this is my very first book. Yeah. So look, often first books are more an autobiography. So this is very much, this was written over a decade ago now. And that is very much more about my life story at that time. And I guess it was a time, even I guess my entry into the media was partly because there was such a big demand for Muslim voices. So I was a Bangladeshi. I came from a non-religious family. So that's where my story is quite interesting at that time, around sort of terrorism, all that kind of stuff, where there was a huge demand for Islamic stories. And I think my one was a little bit different because I came from non-religious family, and I had the psychiatry angle, and it was a very positive story. And it partly drove my politics too, in a way, because I was someone that didn't necessarily see the whole victim angle. I could see some of the problems in the Muslim community, and that's been a factor in my wider politics over time. And I guess it was a time, but The Exotic Russell, look, it's a funny book. In fact, it's on the curriculum at schools, one of the chapters. The story Exotic Russell is in Year 9 curriculums right across the country. It's compulsory in Victoria, but other parts, I think it's optional. So look, I'm very proud of that book, but it's a light-hearted one, but it does have some deeper themes about it, essentially about identity formation and about how many of us, particularly those migrants, but to some extent all of us, we don't come with definitive identities anymore, right? So we pick and choose, and we kind of construct an identity, and that's where this Russell comes in. The Russell is this package of eggs, breadcrumbs, etc., packaged together. And in some ways, the Russell is a theme of identity in that book.
Right. Yeah, it's I haven't read it, but I'll talk to my kids. I bet they have. Look, in your considered, I swear I'm wrapping this up. In your considered professional opinion, though, like I've read some of your other articles, and is like your Australian male bogan, in so much as like, and I kind of know what we all know what you mean by that. Are they the people that really are the bottom of the hierarchy now, and are they actively discriminated against? What, really?
Well, to some extent, I mean, modern politics in general, this goes with the whole the rise of Donald Trump. Yeah, the white working class male became the epitome of kind of what was looked down upon. They were seen as racist, uncultured,
anti-gay,
kind of backward, anti-immigrant, you name it, anti-women, whatever it might be. And in part, there was a growing resentment among this group because the modern economy also displaced them. As manufacturing declined, as the place of manual labor declines, all manner of things. So they were cultural outliers, yet there were still these trends going, oh no, male privilege. What about male privilege? And meanwhile, they were struggling to get jobs. They were getting shafted everywhere. They were poor, and they were being told they were privileged. So that's a huge driver of resentment in politics, and one of the biggest trends in the last decade or so, and the definitive trend that led to the rise of Donald Trump. So in many respects, that is true. Now, some of that is changing. Again, after Trump got elected, there was infinite material discussing this. So I think there's a great awareness of that, but doesn't mean it's gone away. But I think politicians, smart politicians have a much stronger awareness of that. And even now with the Albanese government, you can see him very much trying to stay to the centre. And he's very much kind of trying to, and legitimately so, leaning on his working class male roots, which is where the Labor Party, should lie. So yes, to an extent, yes, but there's certainly a far greater awareness of it. And obviously groups like Pauline Hanson, One Nation, they also tapped into that. But there's also some truth in the last election where the professional female was such a powerful, and that's almost the antithesis. You got the white working class male and you got the middle class professional female. That's arguably gives you a real picture of the tensions of modern politics.
Exactly. Well, look, last question, mate. What's the words of wisdom that you want to give to the good listeners of Northern Vibe?
Oh, mate, yeah, I'm trying to think. I didn't get myself ready, but look, I think in terms of what I see in my work, aim for greater self-understanding. Don't get too hung up about public policy. I do think there's a pessimism in public debate, which I think sometimes a bit overwrought. The reality is we live in an amazing country, and I think the vast majority of people are fantastic, right? So I think we get ourselves in a bit of a rut. So don't go around life in this pessimism, because some of that is overblown in the media, etc. And day-to-day life, just retain a real positive outlook. And even your ordinary interactions with people, not unlike the types of debates we've had in this podcast, you can actually make the world better through, just seeing people in an empathetic, dignified way and helping to understand them. You can actually improve the world.
Exactly. So true. It's pretty simple, really, isn't it? And I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Tanveer as much as I did. Got some fantastic ones coming up. I spoke to Kev again, Kev Hine. That was a 3-hour conversation. And the only issue I'm having is like, should I put it all there as one or should I break it up? I've got a couple of other great ones in the can, but I'm always chasing people. If you know anyone who should come on, if you want to nominate yourself, please get in contact with me. Like, share, comment, and I'll see you all next week. Thank you.